Hello and welcome to this second installment in the WAC Lecture Series. Tonight we have Dave Martel of the Biz Archives here with us. He's going to do an introduction on hyper-romanticism. For anybody who's not aware of Dave or who Dave is he's the main editor of the Biz Archives, and he also is a writer himself and does some throat singing, and he's also a thinker. And that's why we brought him here. He's got a lot of really interesting ideas, so I wanted to give him the opportunity to expound on some of that for all of us. So, Dave, thank you for being here, and you've got the floor, my friend.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Jeff and WhiteArtCollective, for letting me come on here and speak about this topic here. For folks that might not be familiar with me, my name is Dave Martel. I am editor-in-chief of the Biz Archives, Weird Tales, Monsters, Magic, and Machines, which is an indie pulp fiction, weird fiction publication. I am also host of The Bog, which is a podcast dedicated to the discovery, study, and proliferation of the ancient Germanic religious tradition in subjects of philosophy, theology, so on and so forth. I was once board member, but still a full member of the Neurona Society, which is a private research institute dedicated to the study of the ancient Germanic religious tradition. I have a background, an educational background in broadcasting and visual arts. I have been involved with many projects, such as the Epicist magazine, which was a magazine that was dedicated to Germanic religious tradition, as well as philosophy and archaeology and such. I have been an avid studier of arts, whether they be visual, musical. I'm a musician as well. I do throat singing. I do regular singing. I play several different instruments and genres, and I'm kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to the arts, and I very much like it that way. So when we talk about what we're going to talk about today is what is called hyper-romanticism, or as I've coined, hyper-rom. So what hyper-rom is not an invention. It's not a revolution. It's not something that I'm bringing up with out of the ether. It is purely just an identification of something that is already happening. It is an amalgamation of many different arts that all have a similar thrust, a similar trajectory, and from my point of view, have a very similar motivation, a similar epistemological basis, if you will. And hyper-rom, before we get into hyper-rom and the art behind it, we have to do a little bit of a philosophical introduction to it before we could build up to what hyper-rom means and how it manifests and how we may be familiar with it. But before we get into that, I want to present an analogy. And I believe that this analogy will be very, very useful for people that might not be familiar with some of this philosophical stuff and all that. It helps visualize it. So I would like everybody to picture on the bottom of the ocean floor, there is a very large aquarium tank, a sealed off aquarium tank. Inside this aquarium tank is a fish bowl. And inside of this fish bowl is a fish. This fish exists inside this fish bowl and does not know that he's in a fish bowl. He doesn't even understand the concept of fish bowl. He's just always been here. He can't see the water. He can't see the fish bowl. He is within this object that was within another object. This is what is called a hyper object. But the fish, he exists in this fish bowl and goes about life and doesn't understand because he has no memory of the open sea. He has no memory of what it's like to exist outside this fish bowl because it's always been. Well, eventually he sees a crack in the fish bowl, and right away he starts to feel the water leaking into the fish bowl. He starts to feel the water's a little bit warmer. It's a little bit saltier. He sees the crack, and this is a crack in reality for him. He looks at the crack and he realizes that, wow, something's not right with my reality. The crack in the fishbowl, as the water begins to leak into his bowl there, he begins to have flashbacks. Not flashbacks of necessarily his memories, but memories of a time before. We are the fish. The fishbowl is hyper-reality, and that is where we exist today. Many of us today will remember a time before hyper-reality. If you are a millennial, Gen Y, maybe a younger Gen Xer or an older Gen Z, you will remember a time before computers, before the internet, before smartphones. This was the time that we recognize as post-modernity, right? This is a time before virtual reality took hold. So before I go too far into that, the water that leaks into his fishbowl that gives him these memories is what we would now identify to be the art forms that we understand today. The art forms that we watch that we might just think are just meaningless modern art forms, but in fact are very, very meaningful to us because they attach us to a mythopoetic current that goes back all the way to our primordial beginnings and then stretches all the way into the future. And when we step into that stream, something very, very special happens. But before we get into all of that, let's take a step back and explore the kind of the phases of modernity. So, when understanding art philosophy and philosophy itself, it's very important to kind of understand the epochs that we have existed in, as well as the technology that influenced them. Um, After the Romantic and Classicist periods and so on and so forth, in the early 20th century, late 19th century, we came into what is understood to be modernity. Modernity was the time of the Industrial Revolution. This is the time that we shed our agrarian roots, our agrarian lifestyles, and exchanged them for one of the socio-political or socio-economic systems of modernity, be them capitalism, communism, fascism, so on and so forth. We left behind the days of farming, the days of most people, they spend their days trying to procure food, and it went into an industrial mode of living, being people working in factories, people working in mines, so on and so forth. So the industrial era existed uh, going all the way up until sort of recently. Um, Probably you could peg it at the 1980s and 1990s is when kind of the industrial era began to change into the epoch known as post-modernity, which is the time of the digital era. This is the digital age where we start getting things like internet and cell phones and digital media, right? So it's important to understand how drastic these changes were. Before modernity, before industrialization, um, people lived pretty much the same way for all time. Excuse me. There's not a whole lot of difference between a farmer in, let's say, uh, 1690 or 1750 and somebody that was a farmer in the Bronze Age. Obviously, there's some different political or social changes. Obviously, there's regional language, dialect differences. There's uniqueness among different people around the world, but functionally, these people that lived this agrarian lifestyle lived mostly unchanged for the overwhelming majority of our existence from the time we invented agriculture, which was sometime in the Neolithic period. So, uh, almost all of written history appears in this time period. Most of how we understood the world existed in this period. And after industrialization, this changed very drastically. Um, we began to stretch out our living situations. People began to live very, very different lives, much higher stress lives. Our diets changed. Pretty much everything about our lives functionally changed very, very drastically. So when we get into the digital age, there is once again another change, right? We get into the time of the internet. We get into the time of cell phones. We get into the time of electronic means and digital media and TV and so on and so forth. While TV was certainly could be found in decades prior to that, uh, they became a household thing. You know, for those of you that were alive for the 90s and the 80s, how many of you remember that there was only one TV in your house? And that was maybe in the living room, and it had a dial on it, right? You changed the channels from the dial, and you only got a few channels. And then cable came out, and maybe you had 30 or 40 channels. Nowadays, there's a TV in every room. TVs are very affordable. They're very portable. They're mass produced. Everybody has a TV. Everybody has a screen in their hand. Everybody. So when we look at the artistic philosophy of these epochs of modernity and post-modernity, we look at modernity and we see writers like T.S. Eliot, like Robert Frost, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck. These are very much viewed as kinds of the classical modernist authors of that time period. And Ezra Pound as well. A lot of folks here will be familiar with Ezra Pound. What was the philosophy of this period? Well, it was what would be called reductionist. It was kind of shedding the obsolete, or as they perceived, obsolete, unnecessary ornateness or filigree or detail that was part of art for many, many thousands of years, and reduced it down to just what people need, right? Um, Gone is the ideas of alliteration and writing. Gone are some of the more sophisticated forms of painting and sculpture and the stuff that we associate with the old or even the ancient world, and thus we get modern art. Well, after modernity, the reductionism of modernity, came what is known as post-modernity. And post-modernity is this idea that is effectively deconstruction. From reduction comes deconstruction. And what the point of postmodernity is to kind of break down this reductionist thing, because after it's reduced, it kind of doesn't mean anything, right? You break it down, you mock it. A lot of times, a lot of people will be familiar with things like critical theory. And now, not all postmodernity is of this kind of nature, but it is very much ironic. It is very much mocking. It is very much unserious. It's contains a lot of, as we would understand, to be like meme speak, right? This is very much associated with postmodernity. After postmodernity, you get into what we now understand to be hypermodernity. So, um, the kind of the center space, the kind of community space, the commons of modernity was still sort of like it was in older times. Your common space were places like the church, the community center, you know, Uncle Joe's backyard barbecue. People were still meeting in physical space to do this, right? This was still, you still had very national economies. You had things were made at home. For the Americans out there, everything made in the USA meant something, right, back then. Um, Once you get into post-modernity, this is now the time of international economies. This is the time of globalism, where globalism takes hold. This is the time where the commons of old, being your flea markets, your grocery stores, your churches, so on and so forth, the commons there then get shifted into a more international space, a place where international goods are sold. The shopping mall is often considered the commons of post-modernity. As we travel forward into hypermodernity, the defining element of hypermodernity, where we are now, is the virtual space. Things, the virtual space means more than reality. In hypermodernity, things that exist online are more valuable than things that exist in reality. And for folks that might hear that and find that a little odd or a little off-putting, let me put it to you this way: nowadays, what you say online has far more weight than what you say in real life. You say something wrong online, you can lose your job, you can lose your livelihood, your family will turn against you. However, if you say the same things at a public setting, there's not nearly as much a problem with it because it doesn't exist in the virtual space. It doesn't have as much value. Moving on to another example. Show me a physical dollar, a monetary note anywhere in the world that's worth as much as a Bitcoin. The virtual cryptocurrency is more valuable than any money on the planet, worth more than gold, worth more than American dollars, worth more than English pounds, worth more than yen. You can't find one that's worth as much as cryptocurrency. Now, when we get into art, show me a piece of art that goes on as much as NFTs do. So when we look at what is the virtual space and what is hyper reality, we're looking at how we are the fish. We are trapped in this hyper object. We are trapped in this virtual reality, right? Everything that is within the virtual space is more valuable to society than what is in what some folks would call meat space. And this has very, very severe consequences. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. What we're here to talk about is what kind of art form could possibly grow out of an artificial inorganic space such as hyper reality, right? It has gotten absurd with hyper reality. In hyper reality, we are now starting to see things like parasocial relationships, people that believe that they know the people that they see on TV. The truth that gets put forth in virtual space means more than anything you could possibly see in real life. People believe the narratives from what they hear on TV, from what they hear on the radio, from what they read on on the internet, more than what they even experience in real life. If what they experience in real life goes against what they read and what they understand from the virtual space, they will reject reality. Their personas that they create online become their true selves, and then their physical selves exist subsequent of that. It becomes an emanation of that. We are entering a time of not just enter. We are here. We have arrived to hyper reality, to hyper modernity, and this is a problem. Because what happens when you're in a hyper object? What happened to the fish when he's in the fish bowl in the aquarium at the bottom of the ocean? He forgets who he is. He forgets what fish even means. He's detached from reality. He's detached from the nature that birthed him. He's detached from all that it means to be fish. And that is what the hyper object does. It detaches you from reality. And we are the fish in the hyper object in the fishbowl. So, why is it that we feel that we have this such a nostalgic feeling for things from our childhood? Us being the demographic that I mentioned, probably the overwhelming majority of you listening, younger Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Y, and then older Gen Z. I'm assuming most of you listening are of this demographic. Sales data is suggesting that we, as a generation, purchase more stuff that uses nostalgia branding than any other generation. It's insane. We are the generation of nostalgia. More so now, every generation has nostalgia for their childhood, but why is it that it's so much more intense for us? Well, it's so much more intense for us because it is actual memories of a time before we were in the fishbowl. We love the things that were around in our childhood because it reminds us of a time when we were more human. We love these ideas. We love the cartoons from when we were kids. We love old school professional wrestling. We love the music from that time period. We love the games from that time period. We just absolutely adore the aesthetics and kind of the art forms of the 80s and 90s. And it's not that there's anything necessarily specifically special about these art forms, but these art forms existed prior to us being trapped in the fishbowl, of hyper reality. So when we talk about hyper romanticism, or as I call hyper-rom, um, what we are talking about here is an art form that already exists. And we can look around at kind of art forms that exist already and see hyper-rom in them. But we have to first explore what hyper romanticism means. Now, everybody's going to be familiar with romanticism in itself, the art movement that appeared out of, I guess you could say, like the 17th 18th century. And this was an art period that was associated very much with feeling. It was associated very much with um, 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 I guess you could say social ills. This was associated with beauty. This was associated with romance, and not necessarily romance as just falling in love, but romance proper is what romanticism was about. You had many artists that painted things like you had of Greek deities, of war scenes, of serene landscapes of nature, and it was very much associated with human emotion, kind of this return to what it means to be human. This was a reaction to the previous era of neoclassicism, um, where classicism was very much logical, scientific. It was about man conquering nature, and and it had a very sterilizing effect. So we are in a very similar kind of um, time period now, where things like science, things like secularism, things like humanism and liberalism are creating this very sterilizing, pasteurizing, I guess you could say, kind of effect on our identities as human beings. And it's going so far as it's influencing us into eras that are absolutely monstrous. Things that Nikola Tesla would describe as man-made horrors beyond our comprehension. Things like synthetic wombs, things like transhumanism, things like gene editing, things that are just absolutely insane. Ideas of uploading consciousness into machines, if that's even possible, right? So what is hyper-rom, and why is it important? So when we look at kind of the art forms that are kind of coming out of this era, you're seeing a lot of retro video games, right? You're seeing a lot of pixel art in video games. You're starting to see tabletop role-playing games, huge indie scene of tabletop role-playing games. You're seeing things like urban exploration, where you have photographers that go into abandoned buildings and take pictures of these decaying old structures, kind of this like mournful discovery of these buildings that were kind of forgotten and pushed out of view. Big beautiful structures. You have things like new wave of traditional heavy metal, where you have guys that are playing a genre of heavy metal that was thought to be gone, long extinct, replaced and made obsolete by more superior styles of playing. But for some reason, it crops back up. Why? Why do all of these kinds of um, um, art forms keep cropping up, using the aesthetics? Folks here would be familiar with something like fash wave, right? Retro wave music. Who would have wanted to bring back? Who would have thought back in the 90s that retro wave music or dungeon synth or any of this kind of stuff would make its way back? The reason that it's making its way back and people are getting back into it, and not just these art forms, but the mediums that held them. Analog recording is making a comeback. People are recording their albums. Musicians are recording their albums specifically so they can be distributed on vinyl and cassette. Cassettes are coming back. People are collecting VHS tapes. These types of mediums are on their way back. Book sales are going through the roof. There's this kind of mantra from big publishing that people don't read books anymore. They don't buy books. No, they're just not buying your books. They're still buying. In fact, they're buying far more books than they have in the previous decade. Book sales have gone through the roof. Not Kindle sales, not ebook sales. People want physical books. They want paperbacks. They want comics. They want graphic novels. People want organic art forms, even though they're all obsolete. They're completely obsolete. There's no reason to buy a cassette tape. There's no reason to want these old vintage mediums of art and these old vintage art forms. By all logic and all reason, they should be rendered obsolete, but we are getting back into them. We love them. We're promoting them. We love this aesthetic of the 80s and 90s. But why? As I mentioned before, it reminds us of the time before we were in the fishbowl. So effectively what hyper-romanticism is romanticism is a reincarnation of romanticism, but trapped within the hyper object. It is a revolution against the sterilizing effects of modern technology, sort of like how romanticism was before. However, it has a little bit of a different vibe, because hyper-rom is, if you look, there is kind of this feeling of I don't want to say maximalism, but this feeling of we want a lot of these things are very sensationalist, right? They're very colorful and vibrant. They're very extra. There's a lot, right? It really forces you to feel something when you see these art forms. It is kind of this chimp out, right? This extreme kind of expression of these art forms, because they're not necessarily identical to the art forms that we remembered in previous decades, but they very much mirror them. And I want to point out a few of the things that I'm noticing within this art form, or this art philosophy, that kind of ties all of these new art forms together. A lot of these, whereas classicism was very much about man versus nature, post-modernity was very much about man versus nature, and romanticism was sort of this bringing about of natural man. Well, we are also bringing about kind of this organic view of natural man. It has become nature versus machine, which is a philosophy that we've never seen before. A lot of art forms that come out now have to do with not just rebelling against machines themselves, but against technological society and the trappings of it, kind of the machinations of it, rebelling against kind of the thought policing that happens as a result of hyper reality. It rebels against a lot of these kinds of things. It is the fish in the fishbowl realizing that there is a crack and bouncing around and flailing about, hoping that he can break free from it. And this is what I'm seeing in a lot of these art forms that we are coming out with now. There's a rawness and an intensity, and most importantly, it upholds, while it is a lot and it's sensational and it is very vibrant, it upholds, probably more than anything else, authenticity. A lot of people are very, very tired of the irony that is present in post-modernity, because that doesn't have staying power, that doesn't have foreverness. Things that tap into the primordia, if you will, into the mythopoetic current, if you will, have foreverness. And that is what we wanted to tap back into. Because if we tap back into this current of foreverness, this mythopoetic current that ties us from the ancient world to the future, we truly remember what it means to be human. And although these art forms that we like so much give us this feeling, there's this kind of problem with it, right? Whereas insofar as there are people that reject what we like. There are people that reject what is meaningful to us. There are a lot of people that engage in what I would call not romanticism or hyper-romanticism, but fetishism. There are folks that they view, because they reject hyper-reality, hyper-modernity, they then reject all things associated with modernity. And as a result, they cling on to things from the ancient past. You guys that know me, I am the last person to say anything bad about the past. I absolutely adore the ancient world. The writings of the ancient world are sacred and beautiful. They're treasures. The art forms that existed in the ancient world were treasures. But we today do not have the same appeal to those art forms as they did back then. We just don't. We have to understand that we are victims of thrownness, right? We are thrusted into modernity. We are modern people. So what Hyper-Rom appears to be doing is shedding a lot of that self-guilt, that self-hate, and accepting. It's like a stage of acceptance that, yes, these art forms that we like that are today, yeah, maybe they're not as grandiose as Sistine Chapel and marble statues and the Colosseum and Mozart and all of these kinds of things, but they're meaningful to us. So I want to ask you guys that are listening, that may be suffering from a little bit of this self-hate, that might think that our art forms today are stupid or not worth it or whatever. What gets you more excited? What makes your heart pound? Is it listening to your favorite music? Is it watching your favorite films? Is it playing your favorite games? Or is it listening to symphonies from the 16th century or the 17th century? Or listening to a Shakespeare play? Or what really makes your heart pound and your blood pump and forces you to have this involuntary reaction? I'll tell you what, for me, like I said before, I absolutely love and adore the art of the ancient world. But when I hear something like when I hear like 80s heavy metal, or I realized this pretty recently. I was at a bar, and somebody turned on WWF entrance music, right? Like the entrance music for wrestlers. And if you're a millennial, you grew up at WWF Attitude Era, WCW, all this kind of stuff. You remember that era. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. It was really cool. But somebody started putting on these kind of like intro songs for these wrestlers that nobody's heard in probably 20 years. And everybody got worked up. Everybody got excited. And this clicked for me. Why is it that we got excited about that? About these professional wrestlers, the old ones. People, they're still wrestling today, but it doesn't have the same allure and the same magic that it did once. Why is that? Well, is because pro wrestling in that time period was very much part of the mythopoetic current. It was part of the primordia. And that might sound silly to you, but think about it like this. When we watched pro wrestling as kids, um, we were watching a simulation, which was a memory of old school gladiatorial combat. That was our version of the gladiator pits. That was our version of the home gangs. That was our version of watching warriors fight. But it was a modern version of it. That was our version of that. So what we need to realize as artists today is that our the art and everything of our ancestors was gorgeous and was beautiful and our treasures. But if we do not create art to move forward out of our epoch, then that art is being done a disservice. We are betraying the ancient artists by not continuing the tradition of creation of art. So when we talk about hyper-romanticism, what is it? how do we put it? And let me bring up my notes here. So so what is what was the point of romanticism, and what is the point of hyper-romanticism? The point of hyper-romanticism is effectively to repair the mythopoetic current, to come into our hyper reality, and to remind us of what it means to be human before we lose it. So when we talk about the technologies of hypermodernity and hyperreality, what we're talking about is this. Actually, we're gonna skip that for today because we're already coming up on 40 minutes. But another thing that I've identified as important to hyperromanticism is what I would call artistic tribalism. There is this phenomenon that is going on where you have uh, not necessarily regional subcultures, but you have effectively art gangs, is what I would call them. You have groups of people that form these small communities in the virtual space to create this type of art. And this is different from original romanticism, because original romanticism was very much about individualism, right? It was about individual expression. Since we've had individualism for so long, it seems to be that people are gravitating now towards collectivism, towards collective tribal expression. People want to create art and to engage in communities online where there is a consensus on things. So there is what a phenomenon that I would call artistic tribalism. I would say that the White Art Collective is a perfect example of artistic tribalism. This is not this kind of grand overarching art movement, and it has this overarching philosophy across the board, across countries or nations. You now have small communities engaging in the virtual space to come together and create art that reflects them in like local, like it's like the concept of a meme that is meaningful to people that exist in maybe this chat room or on this forum board or whatever. Because we have to remember, the virtual space now is the commons. So when we come and engage in the commons, we're doing so differently than what people did in previous art eras. So hyper romanticism, at the end of the day, is a effectively a revolt against this hyper object that we're trapped in. It is a revolt against the hyper reality that we are trapped in, and it is using aesthetics that we remembered from a time before this, and we are using them as weapons in what I would call virtual vandalism. And I'm seeing this all over the place. People weaponize their art. They throw it out there to mock the system, to mock social media, to mock and to not necessarily mock in a postmodernist sense, but as a cudgel, to flex, to express yourself, to blow off steam. It seems to have an aggressive quality. It seems to have a little bit of a psychedelic quality. It is there's a lot to it that that's kind of coming together. But at the end of the day, hyper romanticism is us being trapped in hyper modernity, reconnecting with the primordia, with the mythopoetic current, and remembering the memories of what it means to be human. So we can break the uh, one day we can break the fishbowl and go out into the aquarium, and then one day return to the sea and not swim like we did before, but swim in a way that pushes us forward into a brand new epoch. And that's going to be the conclusion.
All right. Very nice. Very fascinating there, Dave. Um, Lots of interesting stuff. So, guys, we're going to open up some questions here in a minute if anybody has any. So I'll take a look at that here in just a second. A lot of stuff there that really hits me hard personally is just something I see happen a lot in our spheres, and I think I've seen this happening for a long time. There's kind of this guilt that goes beyond kind of white guilt, and it's almost like a guilt, like modern guilt. It's like
Hmm.
people just feel that, I don't know, because they have it easier than people had it in the past, that we're not as good as them, we're not as strong as them. So we do have this kind of fetishism of the past. And I mean, like you said, and I'm the same way. I have the utmost respect for all of those who came before us, the art, all of the brilliant things that were created and the things that were bestowed upon us.
Yeah.
I have the utmost respect, but at the same time, like, I don't think those people were better than us. We literally came from them, and there's no reason we can't create things just as brilliant as they did. And I think actually we have an obligation to make things that are better, because we're building off of the bodies of knowledge and that they created throughout their lifetimes and those millennia, and now we were just given all of that knowledge, and that just downloaded it, so to speak, all at once. And so, like, we should be able to kind of go beyond where they are, in my opinion.
And maybe we aren't as strong. Maybe we aren't as tough. Maybe we aren't of the same quality that they were. But we are us, and we have to accept what we are, and we have to fulfill our chapter in the grand ancestral saga, whatever that may be. And who knows? Maybe the people that come next will look at us and be like, "Man, we wish we were as tough as those guys." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or maybe they end up being tougher, and they look back at our art and they say that is truly an inspiration, because we can't let this go. There's this kind of dichotomy that happens here, where you have, I'm sure people are familiar with the Greek myth of Epimetheus and Prometheus, right? Where these two beings, they went, and kind of the misconception of it is that Prometheus is like this good guy that liberates mankind and gives them the fire and like all of this kind of stuff. Prometheus is kind of the forward looking being, and Epimetheus is the hindsight, right? Is the guy that looks backward. Well, to have fetishism towards the past is very Epimethean, right? It's very, very stagnant. When you only have interest in the past and you don't have interest in the present, you can't move to the future. You become stagnant, and when you become stagnant, you will decay and you will die. Whereas if you go full the other way, Prometheanism is kind of this ideology that was adopted by Kabbalists and Luciferians, and this idea that you should just move forward uh, with full power, full steam, and it is an example of hubris. But they never bring up what Prometheus's fate was, because of his hubris, and because he did not think, and because he did not consider the repercussions. He ended up chained to a rock with his innards being torn from his body every single day, forever and ever, over and over again, till the end of time. He ended up being punished in the absolute worst way possible. So we have to understand that both Prometheanism and Epimetheanism are both detrimental, and instead there must be a balance where you are informed by the past, you are have your feet in the present, and you use what you know in the present to move to the future.
Nice. Yeah, I agree. There has to be a balance between those two tendencies and those two kind of mentalities. Um, let's see. Okay, we did have a question here. So from Freighter is asking on YouTube, what does Mr. Martel think about things like new mythology, i.e., Lovecraftian elder gods interacting with the tribal spirit?
Um, well, what does he mean by that? Does he mean like, are they real? Like, do they really interact with us, or I'm kind of unsure what he means by that.
Yeah, if you could, Freighter, if you could clarify. Okay, here's the he. How does one see the line from the leaf to the root? Is that doing anything for you?
No. Sorry, that's a little esoteric.
That's even further away. Okay. All right. Freighter, if you could clarify your first question there, we'll see if we can get an answer for you. But something else that you had said, Dave, that I was thinking about, that's really interesting what you're saying there about the art gangs. It's true, yeah. And WAC is one of those. There's a lot of those just kind of in our spheres, and it is kind of interesting to see that. Though a lot of them are kind of adjacent. Obviously, there's some overlap and whatnot. But kind of my hope is that, and I think what needs to happen is that we do need some kind of overarching philosophy. You know what I mean? That if we do stuff like this right here, and kind of if the art and culture spheres could develop our own kind of philosophy of this moment and understand what it is that we're living through. That's why I think it was so I wanted you to do this talk about the hyper-romanticism, because we need to understand what it is that's happening so that we can figure out kind of where we go from here, you know. So I hope that perhaps if we become self-aware of what's going on and kind of what we're all kind of, you know, perhaps the people who are kind of fetishizing the past a little bit too much, to get a better balance of that, so that maybe we can start to be more in the present and figure out a better path forward. So that's what I hope will come of, you know, or at some point, you know, and we hopefully we can contribute however small to that, small or large.
Yeah, if I had to, like I said, I'm not inventing anything here. I'm just kind of observing what I'm seeing across many of these different art forms. And like I said, art gangs. Jeff, you said you see it. White Art Collective is one. The Bizarre Archives is one. There's there's art gangs all over the place. This is kind of like the defining organizing feature of hyper romanticism, is these like localized art gangs, right? And I think that this is really, really interesting because what comes out of these art gangs, which are sort of kind of the virtual version of a subculture. Jeff, I'm sure you remember music scenes and art scenes, or like scenes and subcultures, where you
Right.
would have kind of a local venue or a local group of bands, or whatever, what have you. And from these little localized cells of artistic energy would grow these really tremendous things, right? These really talented people, or these great ideas and stuff like that. And now we have just grillions of them everywhere, these little art gangs. And what kind of ties them together is not this is not necessarily that there is a top-down commanding philosophy, but kind of this innate need to escape hyper reality, right? This kind of like innate understanding, this instinctive understanding that this ain't right. This is inorganic. We want to bring the organic back. We want to bring the authentic back. We've had enough of post-modernity. We've had enough of their irony and like their mockingness and their deconstruction. And we've had enough of that because it's not sincere, it's not authentic, it's not real, it's not human. It's just a big joke, right? It's just like nihilist. And we don't want that anymore. We want something that gives us that lets us experience the human experience itself, right? At the kind of, it's like this like frustration and this it's just really interesting to see, even in things that are very, very mundane. And another thing, so I would say um that the art gangs are a defining element. The authenticity, like this demand for authenticity, because what is art? Art is something. Well, this is a debate that people could have and pull hairs, and we could debate this all day long. Art effectively is fantasy. It is immersion, that which can immerse you into a fantasy, and force you to feel something that thrusts upon you an involuntary reaction. And this is kind of the goal of hyper romanticism, is that it's completely authentic. It is how it seems. There's no underlying messages or anything to be discerned from it or up for interpretation. Here it is. It punches you in the face and it forces you to feel something, whether it's excitement, whether it's happiness, whether it's sadness, or whether it's hatred or lust or what have you. Kind of it wrenches the human form and forces out these like raw human primal emotions, even if it's on a very small level. I would also say that there's a really common theme of authority. And this is kind of attached to my previous point, insofar as the art itself kind of commands you to have this reaction. It's not like, here, let's meander around and explore it and do all this kind of. It's like, no, you're experiencing this now. You're here, and you are going to have this reaction whether you like it or not. It's completely involuntary, and this is something that I find very interesting, right? So I hope I made a succinct case here. I started out with this really big outline, and I had to chop like all of it, because when I would practice it in my head, it was just it was a monster. So I hope I hit everything succinctly.
Yeah, I think you've made the main point that you were trying to with the yeah. I think that you did. I think it makes sense to me, and I think the audience understands. Um, and I think it's the thing that's really hits me personally, and well, another one of the points is the authenticity. One of our artists, Saint Friendship, once described the White Art Collective as a space for white sincerity, and that's really I loved that phrase, and that's something that is really important to me, and I think you've nailed it there. It's really important to where we are now, is that to be very sincere and authentic, um, that is a reaction to that, the deconstruction. It's a reaction to the cynicism of what we've been under for so long, and the irony. I hate irony now. Like, everything's ironic, everybody's sarcastic. It's a bold thing. It's a bold statement to actually mean what you say sincerely, and to communicate and try to move people, and that's, to me, that's what I've always wanted in my art, really. It's like that's what I want to hear, that's what I want to see. And just these levels of irony, and I think people they're just lost in it. And I like that you use the term, people need to be like punched in the face with this feeling, so to speak. Like, it just needs to come across very strong. And I think that's, yeah, exactly, that's kind of, people kind of need, you kind of need shook awake out of this current state that they're in, this hyper reality of that we're living in right now.
Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed about, not all, but a lot of the Gen Z generation, is they have this kind of like dead eye, right? They have this very, and it might be just because they stare at screens their whole life. It might be, for whatever reason, maybe their dopamine levels are too low. It's probably like an all of the above answer. But there's something about them that they're kind of uh like they have this zombie look about them, and not, like I said, not all of them, but a very large portion that it's noticeable. It's also probably because they all smoke too much pot, but they have this kind of dead stare about them. And I would very much coin this as the kind of the result of hypermodernity. Hypermodernity, when you're in the virtual space for too long, you become detached from humanity. And humanity is very much part of nature. When I say nature, I don't mean just like physical nature. I mean nature as in all of the above, all of our imminent reality, all of, whether we're talking about dimensions, or outer space, or you know um, different planes of existence on cosmology, or whatever we're talking about here. That is nature, and man uh, is part of that, until we kind of created this false nature inside of false nature, right? So we have our natural space, the biosphere. We created the technosphere, which is technological society. And then within technological society, we created virtual space. We now have hyper reality within that. So we are inside, at the bottom of the ocean, inside an aquarium, inside of a fishbowl. We're like in a thing, in a thing, in a thing. And it's so messed up, and it takes us so far removed from what and who we are, that people are just, in their art, they're just like they're either rejecting it, or it's just kind of like mournful, just mockery of it, or people are just sick of it. They don't like simulations. They don't want to be part of the simulacra anymore. They want to feel human again. And this is why we're seeing all of these vintage mediums come back. This is why we're seeing tabletop games and war games come back. This is why we're seeing cassette tapes. Who would have thought cassette tapes would come back, right? It's really incredible to see this kind of desperate, um, flailing desire to get back to feeling like we did before hyper reality. And it is completely reflected in the art forms, in my opinion. And I think that it's important for us to keep this in mind as we create art moving forward. And remember that it is important for us to create art that appeals to us today, that is effective, and not just trying to emulate the ancient world, or just sit and stagnate and gawk at ancient things all day long, right? And like I said, we both said, but nothing at all. Absolutely adore. I find the ancient world to be sacred and holy and absolute treasures. But if we're not creating things now that reflect who we are now, then we are not going to go anywhere. We're going to stagnate, and nothing is going to change ever. And people need to realize that art a lot of times precedes political movements. Art precedes nationalist movements. Art precedes social movements. Uh, just about every major political upheaval or what have you, the ideas were inspired by the art that preceded it. So it's very, very important for us to create art today.
Yes, I totally agree. We've been, and I did a lecture last week, and I pointed that out. Culture is upstream of politics, and art largely drives culture. And I think that's something we just got to keep pushing. A lot of people, they say that, and they think they kind of theoretically understand what it means, but they don't understand what it really means. Is that no, we need, just like you just said, we need an art movement to precede the thing that we'd like to see happen politically. Like it's the physics of how this works, whether we like it or not. We could argue that there's some kind of feedback loop, that politics affects culture. Yes, there's some truth to that. But ultimately, like, there has to be a core of culture that is changing and moving forward, that has a different vision, and that is basically memeing that into reality. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of how that works.
And for folks, I want to make this point. Folks need to understand that the nature of technology, the nature of epochs, and the way that history flows, there is no going back. We are not going to go back to an ancient time. We are not going to ever go back to certain ways of life. We're sort of stuck here. We can. It's going to be tough to rewind. You can't. Once something is out of Pandora's box, so to speak, you can't put it back in. And technology is like this. So, and I wanted to kind of add on to that, and so it's not a black pill. That the folks that might listen to that and listen to other people that talk about hyper reality, um, that this is just a black pill. We're careening headfirst into this horrible dystopian kind of cyberpunk world where people are gonna be born out of plastic sacks and be genetically assembled, and it's gonna be some multicultural globo homo like hellscape. Um, that is not sustainable. The fishbowl is not sustainable. Will never be sustainable. Um, Technophiles have done a very, very good job of baking into us this presupposition that for them the sky is the limit. They have done a very good job of making sure that we all just presuppose that they'll be able to colonize space, that they'll be able to upload our consciousnesses, that we'll have singularity, that we're all going to descend into these genetically altered mole people that serve this self-aware AI machine, and like all this kind of really, really spooky man-made horror stuff. But here's the reality of their situation is that technology has a limit. Technology hits a wall. They've been working for decades now to try to develop something that can move them past the microchip. They can't. It's very, very possible that the level of technology that we have today is the limit. This is as far as we can go. Not just as far as innovation, but as far as the resources needed to maintain it. Here's the reality. This is truth. We are running out of oil. The world is running out of oil. A lot of this stuff that we're seeing on a geopolitical stage is about positioning different nations to have access to the remaining oil reserves, right? In the next 100 years, we might not, it probably won't go dry, but there will be a deficit of oil and petroleum products, crude oil specifically. Without oil, you cannot mass produce microchips. You cannot mass produce plastics. You cannot mass produce pressurized wood. You cannot mass produce just about everything and everything, right? Everything in the world is measured by its value with the petrodollar, because look around you right now. Every object from your desk to your chair to your computer requires oil for it to be manufactured, for it to be shipped, for it probably has petroleum in it. Without oil, that whole system crashes and burns, because there is not a single resource on the planet that can generate the energy that oil can. Um, Smart countries will probably go to coal and natural gas. Solar energy is so inefficient and ridiculous that it's never going to be viable. So once this goes down and the global economy goes down, we will go back to somewhat of an agrarian lifestyle, when there's no longer a such thing as a supermarket. When that's no longer a viable thing, people will need to grow their own food. However, we can't unlearn the technology that we've learned. We're not going to go back to serfdom. Well, we probably will go back to a certain type of this, but we are going to enter in a new epoch of what I would call folk futurism. That is my prediction of the next epoch. But back to art. The reason that we need this art now is so that we don't forget who we are when we go into that epoch. Because when we go into that epoch, we are going to need to reconnect with what it means to be a human, right? Because the virtual space will no longer be important. So it's very much our art now. Think of it as, yes, a rebellion against our hyper modern prison, but also as a message in the bottle, or an encapsulate and protect a truth to be put into the zeitgeist, to be carried over into the next era.
Whoa, that's heavy, man. No, that's good. That's interesting.
I hope that's interesting for people.
No, that's great. Hey, I do have a question from somebody here.
Yeah.
Here we go. This is Javier. He's asking over on YouTube, are there going to be any external visual or literary representations of Hyper-Rom in the future?
Yeah, well, there's actually a couple guys that are like brewing up a little bit. I have not proposed this on a large scale yet. I've kind of had like little talks on my Telegram, or like we talk about it in the Biz Archives, but some guys are writing essays. Like this was just kind of something that just popped in my head one day, and I started talking to folks about it. And also shout out to my kinsman Xavier, who's been kind of like my right hand man in like kind of talking about this and fleshing this idea out. And I think it's got a ways to go. But this is, I think, the groundwork of a philosophy that we can take seriously as artists, to understand why we're making art, to understand the nature of the environment that we're creating art in, and who we're creating art for, and kind of the goal of it. And it's not just, and there's been kind of previous like little art ideas and stuff like that, and they kind of didn't really go anywhere because they didn't really have a destination they wanted to go, and they didn't really kind of they just thought it looked cool or sounded cool and just went with it, and then it fizzled out. So I wanted to kind of put together this thing and see uh, how and why we are addressing our current dilemma and where we can go with it.
Well, yeah, I think it's really fascinating, and I would love to see some more stuff on it, like he was saying there, books, just more, fleshing it out, so to speak. Um, and I'm going to listen back to this just to try to absorb all the things you said as well, because this was very. I know you you sent me like an initial outline, and it was like really really dense, but you did a good job of cutting it back. But even still, all of this is a lot to fully grasp. So but it's great, man. I think this is really fascinating stuff, and this is helpful in understanding, as we've been saying, where we are, where we need to go, where we've been. But all right. I don't think it looks like we have any more questions. Dave, is there anything else you wanted to add there as a conclusion, or anything you're working on you want to tell folks about?
Yeah, well, in conclusion, I want people to really focus on this one thing that I brought up. Um, what we are today, it may not be as grandiose, it may not be as great, or as it might not be what our ancestors were, but it's who we are, and who we are is meaningful to us today, and um, we need to shed that type of guilt, that um, the guilt associated with being modern. Um, all of us have critiques of modernity, obviously. We just talked about it all day just now. But we have to realize that we have to come to terms with who and what we are, and learn to enjoy and not have so much self hate and this guilt associated. This is kind of like the other side of white guilt, right? The other side of white guilt, in that what I am today is not meaningful. What you are today is very, very meaningful. And if you don't realize this, there will be no meaning for tomorrow. So we have to rediscover our meaning in ourselves today, and utilize this to create things that are beautiful, and things that are um, imaginative, and things that are just good, and most of all, authentic. We have to create authentic, original art today, because who and what we are today is meaningful. That's what I want to. That's what I want to kind of close on. Um, and then a quick shill. Guys, go buy Bizarchives, bro. What are you doing? TheBizarchives.com, dude. The Bizarchives, Weird Tales of Monsters, Magic, and Machines, issue 2. Hey, everybody here knows Don Kent. Dude, issue 2 is completely filled with art by Don Kent. Go buy a book. I'm telling you, you're gonna love it, because we have issue 3 coming out very, very soon. Really, really crazy stuff. But if you like the Bizarchives, you like what I'm talking about here, you can follow me over on my Telegram at t.me/theBoglord. You can also follow the Bizarchives on both Telegram and Twitter at the Bizarchives, or go to thebizarchives.com and pick up a book. If you picked up a book, we greatly appreciate a review. It takes a few seconds for you. It means the world to us. And I'd like to thank Jeff and you guys for letting me come on and kind of propose my idea. This is not the first time that I've done something like this, but this isn't something that I do a lot. So I hope that it was as succinct that I wanted it to be, and it was interesting for folks. And I hope that everybody enjoyed themselves talking about hyper-romanticism.
Well, yeah, I definitely did, and I think folks did as well. I think you came across very well, and I'm excited by this. There's a lot of things that you said here that are very excellent points in and of themselves, that are clip worthy, things we should be like memeing out there to try to get people on board with. But yeah, man, we were happy to have you, Dave, and we'd love to have you back to do another one of these. If there's another topic, I know you got lots of ideas and lots of things. I saw the initial outline, so we'd love to have you come back to do another one.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you, everybody. Many hails, many blessings.
All right. Thank you all. Everybody have a good evening. Oh, wait. Actually, next week we're going to be doing another one of these. It'll be a little earlier because it's somebody from across the pond in the UK. Brendan Hurd is going to be talking
My
about,
man.
yeah, Arias Press. A lot of you guys know him as. He wrote the book The Decline and Fall of Western Art, which is a fantastic book. And he's going to be coming on here to discuss kind of the first few chapters of that book, which is about the philosophy of modernism. And he talks about art critique, and it'll be also very interesting. So do tune in for that. That'll be at 4 p.m. Eastern next week, which is 9 p.m. GMT over on the other side of the pond. So anyway, do check that out. Thank you guys very much. Everybody have a wonderful evening.